Mr. Frank was in the lab preparing his lesson for the next day because he always likes to be on top of things. Miss Roberts was wandering the halls, loading things into her car for the field trip for the next day, when she saw the love of her life, Mr. Frank, in the lab. She couldn't stop going back and looking at him because she was so in love with him and loved admiring him from afar. You can't blame her. Mr. Frank is one dreamy guy. While she was staring at Mr. Frank, Miss Roberts saw something that she didn't like. Miss McDonald was in the room and was showing a ton of interest in Mr. Frank. Miss Roberts watched closely. It was clear Mr. Frank was into Mrs. McDonald as well. Miss Roberts wasn't going to stand for this. Mrs. McDonald eventually had to leave Mr. Frank alone in his classroom. And that's when Miss Roberts took her opportunity. She brutally murdered him because she wasn't going to allow him to flirt with any other co-worker of hers. She then strangled him with the cord that was available to his death. The deed had been done, and Mr. Frank was dead. Miss Fetsko came into the lab because she saw the light was on. She looked around for anything abnormal. Then suddenly she saw Mr. Frank on the floor dead! She went to check his pulse, and she didn't feel one. She immediately called 911. After that, she called down to the office for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall ran into the classroom, followed by EMS. Mrs. Hall was in such shock about Mr. Frank's dead body, and EMS tried to revive him. EMS pronounced Mr. Frank dead. We believe Miss Roberts was guilty because her blood type was found at the crime scene. This strand of hair was also found at the crime scene, which looks identical to Miss Roberts' hair. Finally, the print of her right index finger was also found on the hammer. Miss Roberts killed Mr. Frank.